We are going to be looking at our identification notes on reptiles. So we're going to set up our notebook. Our name of our species is on our left-hand side, and then we have our name, date, and session, of course, in the top right. We're going to record information about the number of species we might be able to find, lifespan, things that are notable, as well as common diseases. And then I'm going to go into my classwork section, my ID notes, and then I'm going to pull up our first animal we're going to look at is our iguanas. So for our iguanas, there are 35 different species of iguanas. So we go on some trips to some tropical islands. You may see them. Lifespan is about 15 to 20 years in captivity. They're very stocky in structure. They've got saggy skin on the throats and also spines protruding from their heads along their dorsal aspect as well, or their backs and tails. And then they have almost like a neck pooch. So they're going to have very like short bodies, very plump. So that's our iguanas. So here's kind of that standard. We have that beautiful neck flap right here, and then we have those spines along the back. They can be a little ornery, so definitely more of an aggressive aggressive reptile to have. Next, we have our geckos. So there's over 1,500 species of gecko. Depending on their lifespan, that's going to vary on the species. They can drop their tails. So they are one of the iguana breeds that will be, or species that can drop their tail. Their secondary tails never look as good as the first. They drop their tails in extreme stress, so it's not a good sign if your gecko drops its tail versus iguanas. They're not able to drop their tail. So we want to just kind of watch that. That tail is where their fat reserves are at. So again, those are geckos, over 1,500 species. You can see the pads on the feet for this one. So this is going to be a tree-dwelling gecko. And then we have like our leopard geckos that won't have those pads, because they're going to be your desert species. Next, we have our chameleons. So there's 171 different species of chameleon. They live anywhere from 2 to 10 years in captivity. They are very particular about their environment. They are from the rainforest, so it's very difficult to mimic those temperature and humidity settings, right? It's very difficult to mimic that climate. So they do get some nerve impulses and hormone changes that cause the color to change. So there's 4 different layers of skin actually that expand and shrink that cause this kind of blending of the different layers to create the colors and the patterns. When you start to see darkening or some changes in colors, that can be a sign of sickness as well. So you just want to be mindful of that if you are going to be housing a chameleon. And here's a rhinoceros chameleon. But they do have those little fused pads, and they will kind of bob back and forth to get their prey. And then they have those very long tongues that extend out. Next is our bearded dragon. So here we're looking specifically at a species of reptile. So these are Pygona viticeps. So there are 9 subspecies of bearded dragons. They can live about 6 to 12 years in captivity. They do change their color on their neck. That is linked to social interactions. And then they can also change their back color depending on the temperature or, again, medical conditions. Some common diseases you're going to have is this adenovirus and coccidiosis, metabolic bone disease, and then periodontal disease. And then here we have some bearded dragons right there. You can see all the frilly of the spines, and then that little black patch they can adjust to attract more sun, and then their beard actually can go solid black right there. They are sexually dimorphic as well. Some care we're going to get into are UVB lights. So it is imperative that you have UVB lights with your reptiles. This allows the synthesis of that vitamin D3, which is going to allow them to absorb that calcium. You do want to replace those bulbs every 6 to 12 months, depending on the manufacturer. Reptiles are ectotherms. So we don't want to get away from saying cold-blooded because their blood is definitely not cold. It's just that they regulate based off of what the outside temperature is. So they have no internal temperature control versus humans, right, where we're endotherms. So they are going to rely on that external body, that external climate conditions to dictate what their temperatures are. So if it's 95 degrees out, they are 95 degrees, so definitely not cold. But they might feel colder to us because their tanks are not the same temperature as our body is, so it's going to feel colder. But their body temperature is going to be whatever that temperature is of their enclosure, which is why it's so important to monitor those temperatures. We have our heat lamps. So these are electronic devices, of course, that emit heat rather than light. So you can have heat lamps that do have a light to them, where like a brightness, but we use porcelain heat lamps. So porcelain are just emitting heats. There is no light associated with that. That way we can keep that heat on for longer extended periods of time and not affect their diurnal rhythms or their concept of sleep, right, of their timing. So that UVB light will give them the light hours, and then our ceramic emitter, right, our heat emitter is what's giving them a heat, but you can also use colored heat lamps as well. Then we have our heat rocks. So heat rocks definitely need to be avoided because the animals will burn themselves on them. They don't realize how hot they get, and so that will cause that flesh to burn. So you may have heard if you put a frog in water and then put that water in a pot with the frog in it and you slowly heat it, the frog's not going to be able to tell the temperature, so it will just burn itself. So that's kind of the same concept here. So under the tank, heat pads are okay because they're going to dissipate that heat throughout the glass, and many of them now are attached to timers, so that way they're not getting too hot to burn the animal. Then we're going to go metabolic bone disease, or MBD, is something that's very common in our animals. So it's a calcium deficiency. They get bone fragility and malformation. It also is often going to affect reptiles that eat vegetables and insects versus whole prey, because your whole prey is going to have calcium and a little bit more nutrients. So this is where we're using that UVB bulb to reduce risks. We'll also powder supplement our reptiles' food as well to make sure, or our lizards and amphibians, to make sure that they're getting all of the nutrients that they need. So we're going to end with our snakes. So we have a ball python, or Python regius. So common diseases are inclusion body disease, which we'll talk about a little bit later. They have dermatitis or skin infections, and then they can also get infectious stomatitis, which is mouth rot or a bacteria in their mouth that causes some rotting, right, because that bacteria is going to eat away at the mouth. Their lifespan is about 20 plus years in captivity if you're able to meet their needs. They do have pretty strict enclosure requirements. Males are 3 to 4 feet and 4 to 5 pounds, where females can be 4 to 5 feet and they're about 4 to 6 pounds. And so here is just a full-grown ball python right there. So you can see that they will when they, as a defense mechanism, they roll into a ball. They're also constrictors, so they're going to roll their feet into a ball as well. Next, we have a Burmese python, or Python vivipatus. So they will also get inclusion body disease and upper respiratory infections. If your humidity and enclosure is not kept properly, upper respiratory infections is something that is common with our snakes. They can live 12 to 20 plus years in captivity, and Burmese pythons range from 16 to 23 feet and can weigh up to 200 pounds. So due to the pet trade, they are now an invasive species in South Florida in the Everglades. They originated from the rainforests of southeastern Asia, but due to accidents and also purposeful dumping of these snakes in the Everglades, from them being too large, people not being able to care for them, now they have overtaken the Everglades, and so they are very, very dangerous invasive species down there. And so here is a Burmese python, so you can see how large that is. The last snake we're going to talk about is our corn snake, or Paranthropus gutata. So they have two subspecies. They live 15 to 20 years in captivity. Something really notable about them is that they are climbers, so they can also be housed in pairs. There's over 80 color morphs available in captive pet trade, so they've done a lot of different breeding with corn snakes to get a lot of different color variations or color morphs. Same thing with your ball pythons. But they do prefer to climb, so that's why we want to make sure that we have options for them to be able to do so. And then here is that corn pattern on the bottom, and then that light blotch on the top. And those are our reptiles. So we have an end with our inclusion body disease, or IBD. This is a disease of boas and pythons, so it is a virus. Some symptoms will be head tremors, uneven pupil sizes, stargazing, which is their heads arched and they're staring at the sky, and anorexia. So if you put these snakes on their back, they're not able to roll over. So it is a fatal disease. The animals are not necessarily dying from the virus itself, but of secondary infections because their immune system is weakened.